Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Lara Hijaz. I head the Center for Entrepreneurial Development at the IBS CED, and it is my pleasure to be moderating today's session. Now, this webinar is hosted by IBA Karachi's Population Research Center, which is committed to advancing research and dialogue on critical social and economic issues. Today's session focuses on invisible work, visible impact, unpaid care in South Asian communities. Now, global estimates from ILO suggest that women perform approximately 3 times more unpaid care work than men. And furthering this, if unpaid care work was assigned a monetary value, it would account for nearly 10% of the global GDP. This highlights that unpaid care work is not marginal. It's central, it's foundational to how economies function. But it remains an under-recognized component of the economic and social systems. What's particularly important is that unpaid care work does not simply reflect inequality, it actively reproduces it. It shapes access to time, income, opportunities across the life course. So the issue, therefore, is not only recognition, but it's also redistribution and structural transformation. So we are really honored to have with us two distinguished scholars whose work examine unpaid care work across South Asia and diaspora context. I'm just going to introduce both of them in any order. There is, first Dr. Soumya Tripathi, who's an assistant professor at the Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. Her research focuses on gender, caregiving, and socioeconomic inclusion, with particular attention to how structural inequalities shape individual and collective well-being. Dr. Tripathi's work spans unpaid care, gender-based violence, work-life balance, and she employs a range of methodological approaches, including quantitative, qualitative, and computational methods. Our other guest is Dr. Samina Azhar. She is an associate professor at the Graduate School of Social Service at Fordham University. She is the recipient of the 2025 Council on Social Work Education's Feminist Manuscript Award. Dr. Azhar's work engages deeply with issues of gender, caregiving, marginalization, particularly within South Asian and diaspora communities. Her interdisciplinary approach bridges research, policy, practice, making her work highly relevant to today's session. Together, Dr. Azhar and Dr. Tripathi bring a complementary and interdisciplinary perspective, drawing on research across South Asia and diaspora contexts. I now invite them to begin their presentation. Over to you both, guys.
You guys can see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
So thank you, Dr. Izaz. Am I pronouncing your last name correct?
Ijaz.
Is Ijaz.
Ijaz, yes.
Ijaz. So invisible work, visible impact. This topic is very dear to my heart because I grew up in India and in normal, middle class, orthodox, traditional North Indian society. So whenever we say unpaid care work, the first thing that strikes us is a picture of a housewife or a homemaker, which is what this picture represents here. We are taking care of kids, we're taking care of household stuff. But this problem is deep rooted. If you look at the South Asian culture, there is a whole data out there by the World Bank that says young girls, young women, teenage girls, they are involved in unpaid care work too. And I am sure many of our folks who have joined here, they might be able to relate in some way when you have seen young girls taking care of their siblings. Young girls performing, cooking and cleaning, that is their priority versus the school. Guys are given priority in terms of, you have to go school, you have to do something, versus for girls, the primary goal in life is to be just good with something called unpaid care work. You have to be good in household chorus. You have to be good in, managing, let's say, let's make it more fashionable in terms of jargon, managing household or household management. That said, I'll start, with what is unpaid care work. There's a lot of definition out there, including the ILO, UN, WHO definition, covering it from a different angles. However, the most prominent one is the ILO one, which talks about how we can really classify unpaid care work into three major categories, and it is used globally. So that's the basis for all the quant or the qual research that is going on globally on this topic. First one is domestic work for own household, and I don't need to go in detail. It ranges from, cleaning, cooking, laundry, household management to just name it. Then caregiving for household members, which really doesn't restrict to the caregiving for children, but spans to elder care. If you're living in a joint family, then the dynamics are different. If you have someone who's sick in your family, then the dynamics are different. And of course, the burden falls if you have women in family. Now, how that will be distributed between, younger women versus older adult women, that's a different dynamic, and culture plays a huge role here. And then see, there is something called community volunteer service, which most of the time we don't talk about when we talk about unpaid care work. So you need to maintain a good relationship within your neighborhood. You need to know, um, you have to run your family. You're living in society, so you are responsible for making sure you are connected with different organizations out there, with the different families out there, with the different networks out there, and you don't get paid for it. So it is essentially a volunteer service. And depending on how we're going to interpret, you are taking someone to the hospital, you're taking someone for extracurricular activity, you're driving someone to the airport. All those kind of work comes, under this third category, which doesn't have a very abstract definition out there. Then, sorry, I think, yeah, continue to share. Okay. Who really keeps our home families and communities running every day is often invisible. And I would like all of us to think, let's say if women in South Asia, if we say we will not do it, we go on a strike. Is it possible, first of all, to go on a strike? Do we have a union? Do we have that kind of visibility? No. And if that work is stopped, I just wonder what will happen. Whether men will come forward or who will come forward and make those stuff look normal going on. So this has been a big looming question for me for some time now. So we all know it's unseen, it's unrecognized. And the simple it is unseen and unrecognized, if you think it from terms of why it is unseen, why it is unrecognized, that's a whole different story. So in South Asia particularly, and globally, my research says that South Asia and also the MENA region is, these are the two big region. If you're going to map it out geographically on a global map, women disproportionately shoulder this work. And it's all work. Like, we looked into the three classification. So UCW is undervalued. There are researchers, there are scholars who have, who have really computed the monetary value of it. And depending on, what is the size of the country, what is the GDP of the country, the value is gross. It's a gross. So we don't understand it from this perspective that we are losing a good amount of economic productivity for our society, for our community, for our country as a whole. We don't see it from that perspective. Although there's a whole literature, there's a whole calculation that talks about the value of, unpaid care work that is done globally by women in different, spheres and roles. So this is a topic I've been interested in. My own doctoral dissertation was on understanding that how time spent on unpaid care work is associated with economic empowerment indicators, namely education and employment. So, my country, like back, I am originally from India. So, 2019 was the first time the government of India launched the something called time use survey. So just like, how we have this Institute of Population Studies in Karachi, we have similar institute in Mumbai, India, and they do this stuff. They are responsible for doing this kind of survey, collecting those micro data, converting that into, macro available data stuff. So we looked into that data set. That was for the first time, ignoring the limitations of the data. That gives us some idea in terms of where, as a women with our unpaid care work, we are situated. So we have policies in South Asia, including, let's say, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, where we say educate girls. And from past 5 years, we are focusing on educating girls and women in the areas of STEM. However, our research shows there's a whole lot of time that goes somewhere else, even if you're educating. And so education never came up as a very prominent indicator in our regression analysis when we talked about whether is this a very important factor to work on when we're talking about women's unpaid care work. Well, no, employment came as the one. And then to further understand it, I think my screen is not moving. Okay. And to further understand it, I did something called advancing using machine learning. So my data set was not that huge, to be honest, to employ computational social science, but your traditional quantitative statistical analysis, they give you only one story, which was like, what are things that are associated? Prediction was not clear. So I had to use something called machine learning technique called random forest analysis to see what is that number one predicting factor that governs this unpaid care work. And surprisingly, in that study, gender came as the number one factor. So by default, if you are a woman, you will be doing unpaid care work. And it's kind of contradictory, because if you look at some of the current reports of UNDP and UN Women, they say that we will make some progress. We will make some progress on this indicator, but by when? By 2050. So I don't know. We will make some progress. What that some progress looks like. So far, our research has focused on mostly on India. So I have used two big data set. One is the Indian time use survey data and the American time use survey data to look at how this unpaid care work is redistributed and distributed with ethnic minorities in terms of their economic empowerment indicators. I mean, there's a whole huge scope in terms of expanding this to other South Asian countries and also looking at other well-being indicators. So as I said, we have used for our some of the papers that is out there on Google Scholar, we have used different statistical modeling just to get a better sense of this story in terms of how to fix this issue. Like, what is the solution out there? And so we have done like ranging from systematic review to regression to machine learning. We have been there just sitting with this information in terms of what kind of interventions should be pilot tested in this context. And in future, we have an idea to do a qualitative stuff on this issue as well to understand what are the real experiences that are not captured through quantitative survey data. So that's it. Yes, so some of the key findings, as I said, we found that urban-rural difference was pronounced. So rural women often face heavier household obligations, and this could be because rural areas are more agriculture-based, so they contribute there as well, but they are not recognized for it. They have large families, and yeah, joint families, so maybe the workload is more there, and their voice is invisible. Similarly, within socioeconomic factor sphere, lower income women, which is constantly true and supported by the literature. So lower income women will have hard time outsourcing stuff like domestic responsibilities, and so they end up spending more time in terms of the child care, elder care, household work. And household composition matters a lot as well. So married women with young children spend more time on performing unpaid care work, and extended family presence can. So this is this finding in terms of extending family presence can reduce the individual burden. It's twofold. So in some circumstances, if you bridge the data, let's say by geographical region, let's say north or south, something like that, you'll see in some cases having extended family member or having an older adult women in the family might reduce your burden, but if it again depends on the cultural context and where you are situated. But in some cases, again, a lot of responsibility will fall on the younger women in the families. That said, there are some policy implication work that is going on, let's say in Specifically in India, I know about two and one person in the London School of Economics who is the person behind it, where in one of the southern state of India, they have come up with something called remunerating like your unpaid care work. But that was a pilot test and it wasn't very successful. But based on that, they have come up with something called Women Community Care in the Kerala. So these small policy initiatives or programs are still in very baby phase. I mean, we don't have a very um, concrete data to say this is what we found, it's working. Those are trial work that is going on in terms of understanding how to really fix this unpaid time that is good, the time that is going on unpaid care work, because it's not good for women, it's not good for our country, it's not good for anyone in the system. So that said, unpaid care work is critical for our social and economic well-being. It is important for families to thrive, and yet it remains largely invisible and unsupported. So addressing it requires both recognition and targeted policy action. Over to you, Samina.
Thanks. Assalamu alaikum. Just thank you all for the invitation to be here. 103 participants for us, that is like a huge webinar. So I don't know how big that is for your school, but I'm so glad to see that so many people have attended, especially in the midst of, I don't know if this has been the case for your institution, but many of my students in Pakistan are in school remotely now. So just I'm glad to see so many folks here. Maybe that's why so many people are here. They're at home. Who knows? Um, but okay, just wanting to focus this a little bit more on Pakistan. Pakistan was definitely for Somia's work. This is her dissertation work. What it was not focused particularly on Pakistan because we were looking, across South Asia for some of the research and specifically at India for most of the main findings. So I wanted to just see what there was conducted research-wise in Pakistan, and there isn't, unfortunately, a whole lot. Obviously, a lot of the stuff is very similar in terms of, cultural traditions or gender norms or those types of things. So the same ideas regarding gender division of labor, right? The notion that we've talked about already at length, women at home being responsible for cooking, cleaning, washing, things like that. And the sort of multi-role place that they hold within the family where they are taking care of household responsibilities. They may be engaged in family care. They may be doing all types of things to ensure that the family is running. Could you go to the next slide, Soumya, please? Thanks. Right. And so in more rural contexts, it will also mean that women are spending more time on livestock management or perhaps also agricultural tasks, right, in terms of picking crops, in terms of managing animals, perhaps, right? So those types of tasks and how there is also at the same time a gendered role for the tasks that men assume, right? And this, I think, may vary somewhat internationally, but the idea that, if the faucet breaks or you need the trash to be taken out, like certain things seem to be more gendered towards men, right? Construction tasks, perhaps, things like that, right? So not to say that there is not also, I think, domestic labor that is taking place that is being performed by men, and the data does show that, but by and large, it's so heavily skewed towards women. So globally, women represent 2/3 of the health workforce in particular, right? Yet, on average, earn 20% less than men and remain underrepresented in leadership roles. So this is a kind of consistent gender pay gap that we see even when there is paid care work or paid work of whatever kind, right? That there is still a significant gender pay gap. So it's not just, I think, about the fact that the work is not remunerated, which is a big part of it, but also that when people are being paid, when women are being paid, they are going to be paid less, and that's consistent internationally. But definitely, and I'll show this a little bit more acute in parts of South Asia. Thanks. Yeah, next slide. This is data from ILO, 117.4 million people in Pakistan being engaged in unpaid care and domestic work, right? 67.7 million of them being women, right? Around 60% of women spending over 15 hours a week on domestic tasks, while less than 7% of men do the same. And I mean, I think this is, just so clear, just in our own sort of personal experiences. In my own, excuse me, in my own family, uh, I have an older brother and an older sister, and whenever all of us are home together, which unfortunately is rare, but when it does happen, it's so immediately apparent what the gendered roles are, right? Like who prepares the food, who like sets the table, who does the cleanup afterwards, right? Where my brother sits kind of like, the Raja of the house and just, is sort of attended to and has that kind of expectation also. So I think once those norms are set, then it becomes not only normative but really expected, right? And if you don't do it, then you're also seen as perhaps being a bad mother, sister, wife, right? Next slide, please. Yeah. Right. So this is what I was just talking about, these sort of gendered norms, the tasks that women are often seen to be responsible for, tending to be more in this kind of framework of it being seen as nurturing, right? Like the cooking and cleaning task. We just already talked about this. Men might be involved in other tasks. Those other tasks, though, are importantly also more likely to be paid, right? So it may be that households are outsourcing that and just paying somebody to do something like, fixing their plumbing versus having the man of the house do it, fix it themselves, right? Next slide, please. So yeah, this is coming from the Pakistan Labor Force Survey. To be honest, I'm not super familiar with this data. I'm sure you all are probably much more familiar with this than I am, but just showing, this gender disparity. So we see the disparity between with the red line, right? Paid work for men as compared to the orange line for women. You see it even more sort of drastic of a disparity when you're looking at unpaid work, right? So obviously the sort of gender moderation of this effect is very clear, right? You can see it very obviously, right? That consistently women are spending more time. Not a surprise to any of us, I think, but I think also quantifying it, especially in terms of these sort of economic or financial type of analyses, is important, right? Next slide, please. So, right, just looking at the flip side of this, we've been talking a lot about unpaid care work and in comparison, thinking about paid work, right? So, global female labor force participation varies quite widely. It's highest in the Scandinavian countries. Scandinavian countries tend to have like the best outcomes for just about everything. And definitely labor force participation is also the case. Oh, actually, can you keep it on the previous one for me, Somya, for a second? Yeah. So this is just looking at countries outside of South Asia, just as a kind of comparison point, right? So Sweden, 80%, which is like so high, right? Germany, 76%, UK and the US, 57%, 55 for Russia, kind of in that sort of for these higher income countries, over half at least, right? Now we can go to the next slide, please. And so now looking at, for South Asia, oh, I had them both on here. Sorry, that's my mistake for not editing the slide well. But for South Asia, right, that it is clearly significantly lower, right? So for Pakistan, 24%, India, 32%, Bangladesh, 39%, Nepal, 27.5, Afghanistan only 5%. I mean, it's not surprising given the current Taliban regime, but 5%, it's just shockingly low. And Sri Lanka 32%. So Sri Lanka again, not surprisingly, has the highest labor force participation rate. I think many trends in Sri Lanka, being an island, are unique to Sri Lanka, but quite similar to the rates of India and Bangladesh. So yeah, just to kind of think about this in a global perspective. So looking at the disparities that exist both within South Asia itself, right? And I think definitely the impacts that Pakistan is currently having with everything happening is only going to, I think, affect these sort of labor trends further, right? With many industries sort of being on hold, right, without shipments, right? So who knows? I suppose how long that may last, but I think we'll probably see a further dip in these rates. In the coming years, also given the ongoing conflicts at the Afghan border, which, at least in the US, given how much attention is being focused on Iran right now, has really lost focus. So I think that is my last slide. Do I have something else? Yeah. All right. So that's all we have. I'm not sure, Somi, if you have anything else you want to comment on before we open it up for Q&A. I see that there's already, I haven't looked at that, but there looks like there's some questions already.
Yes, I mean, when you were talking about that plumbing thing, it reminded me, if you remember, when we were doing our dissertation, the first paper, quantitative paper. Uh,
Yeah.
so we found that, household expenditure, there was one indicator. I have to go back to that regression result, to the real dissertation. There was
Mhm.
something like time is spent on grocery and buying stuff like for household. And that was very low for the women and that was high for men. So we
Yeah,
were
right. Yeah.
discussing, I remember now we were discussing in terms of like, then who owns the money? There is this whole another thing in terms of, so how much, okay, you have to cook and clean, but what has to be bought for the family in terms of grocery and other stuff? The control of resources was still in men's hand. I mean, when you were saying about plumbing and those things, I remember that. And yeah, the stories are real. Like for me, I can relate. Like when she's talking about plumbing, I relate once in I used to stay in hostel during my bachelor's and master's program, and we had this fuse out, we call it fuse out. So electricity was, neighborhood had electricity, but our building doesn't have. And I remember my father teaching me how to fix the fuse, and I still know how to do it. And that's because he used to travel, and me and my mother and sister, we used to be alone, so we have to know. And when I did that, the guys in the hostels were like, get down, who told you to, with your wires and everything. Although I fixed it, I knew how to do it. So it's a very simple task. But then everyone looks at you like you are just outcasted. You have done something. So when you were saying that, I could like literally relate in terms of the unsaid expectations on which you have to live. And if you don't live, then you see the invisible outcomes as well.
That
Yeah.
is fabulous. Thank you. Thank you both for such an insightful presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Um, Things you were talking about were things I research on, but they're just so routine and they are just so, usual for us women. We live through them. Sorry if there are guys in the audience, apologies. But because we live through these experiences, these just hit hard, and they hit home. So these are very, very important. And, you guys were talking about resources and resource ownership and decision making and agency, even in terms of buying groceries and making day-to-day purchases. So this makes me, I'll just ask my first question. I want you to please help me understand whether you see this primarily as a gender issue, or do you think it is more broadly about economic structures and power relations?
Ramina, you want to go ahead?
Are you sure? Um, that's great. I mean, I saw a similar question actually in the Q&A about this in terms of, looking at you know, gender, income, education, right? Thinking about these things. I think as we often do in academia, in separate silos because that is the structure of kind of organizing education. But in reality, I mean, I don't know. I think it's a mix. Like, I think definitely having built in labor policies that ensure, right, that there is going to be, perhaps we don't have this in the US even, but like gender equity in pay, being able to have equal access, or perhaps, again, this would never happen in the US, but perhaps, quotas or reservations even for women for positions, right? Like that is, there is so much pushback in the US against anything like that, any kind of regulation of the labor market at all. So I think that's ideal. And I think that it's much more likely for those types of policy interventions to happen in South Asia, where there is much less resistance to, the notion of creating these, affirmative action style policies, because it is basically like an affirmative action for women, I think. Um, so I think it's a mix of both, but absolutely, I think, like partly the reason, I mean, there's cultural reasons as well, but I think partly the reason why Scandinavia tends to have such high rates is because they also haven't really reinforced in their labor policy, in very strict ways. And there's also, differences in terms of being able to take maternity leave or paternity leave, right? Like many countries don't really recognize paternity leave as a thing. So I think these labor policies do have an impact on reinforcing the types of things that you would hope kind of intrinsically are values socially. But I think without the reinforcement, that sort of diversity or equity will disappear. And we've already seen this in American education, for example, which has, at least at the public education level, been mandated to not incorporate affirmative action. And you see the difference in enrollment numbers of who is actually going to school and who is graduating from school, who can afford to graduate from school. And those things are very racialized in the American context. So I think that's another piece too, right? I mean, there's such a strong correlation between education and income. So wanting to increase women's like economic empowerment sort of inevitably is going to involve creating more educational or at least vocational opportunities, so that women can have their work paid, right? So even if they are doing the care work, then, maybe there is a way, like with this Kerala example, of course it would be Kerala. Like I'm not in the least bit surprised that it's Kerala, right? For that to happen. And maybe there's some momentum even around ideas around, again, in Scandinavia, but like around universal basic income or these types of ideas. I think if women have, as Soumya was talking about, independent control of their money, that changes many things. And this is a thing that has absolutely been transported from South Asia to the US. So somebody else had in the Q&A, I saw a question about like diaspora differences. And what's been fascinating to me living, I was born in New York City and have lived in the US most of my life. I lived in India for a little while, but most of my life I've lived in the US. And many of the same, gender norms and traditions maintain. So there's many women that I've talked to in the Bronx, Bangladeshi women, and also a colleague of mine is doing research on Pakistani women in Brooklyn. The communities tend to be in, kind of isolated geographic areas. And both of us have found that many times women don't even know how much their husband is making, which I find just shocking. I mean, I actually, the first time this Bangladeshi woman said this to me, I asked her like 2 or 3 times. I was like, no, but like, how much does he make? Like, maybe you don't want to say because he makes a lot or he makes a little or something, and I was like, no, but it's okay. Like, I'm not going to tell anybody. Like, you can tell me. She was like, no, I really don't know. And that is fascinating to me, how you can also be in a marriage and not know, how much your partner is making. But that is the level of financial control that is very real, even in diaspora communities. So
That
Yeah.
is so interesting. That is so interesting. I was researching women and their financialization and later life security, and I've been speaking to women about their savings, their saving behaviors, patterns. What do they do? Do they even think about it? And it's shocking because these women who are, engaged in unpaid care work all their lives. And I'm not talking young girls, I'm talking about women in their 40s and their 50s. And they have just not thought about it either, or they just don't know how to, where to, and most of them are, if they're married, they would be like, "Per- possibly my spouse will take care of me when I am
Mhm. Mhm.
in that age group." It's shocking. It's also a little bit sad. We really need to do some, kind of policy intervention around the kind of empowerment women are being given and the kind of agency they have to make their daily life decisions. I mean, even decisions of what to cook and
Right.
what to buy.
Right.
We have some very interesting questions in the chat. I don't know if you guys are able to see them. I have many questions of my own. I'm going to put a hold on them and I'll go to the student questions. I'll just read this. The first one says, your presentation shows that gender, income, education, family structure, and employment status are major predictors of unpaid care work. Which of these factors is the most actionable from a policy perspective? And where do you think intervention would create the fastest measurable change? Fantastic question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question says that your research and your presentation shows that gender,
Mhm.
income, education, family structure, and employment status are major predictors of unpaid care work. Which of these factors is the most actionable from a policy perspective? And where do you think intervention would create the fastest measurable change?
That's a very good question. Samina, you would like to take this or should I jump
Yes,
in?
if you want to go ahead, yeah, please. Yeah. You want to, or you want me?
So
Do you want me to?
I can jump
Yeah.
in. Yeah, this is okay. So gender by default, I mean, in our presentation, I say this gender is definitely a strong predictor, but other factors that we have mentioned, income, education, and everything, they are associated with the time spent on unpaid caregiving. So by default, for the next 30 years, if you are a woman, yes, you will fall in that category of spending time on care work. That said, we cannot have any like immediate policy intervention or the fastest change that you're talking about in terms of changing gender norms change. It's happening if we go back 30 years. I mean, our countries don't have a very good data to compare, like a quant data. But if you're going to use a sociological perspective and see that it's happening, but those changes are very slow. Sociologists, they call it, social change, and it takes small, like, time. So that is something that will happen with all the, discussion we are having, the webinar we are having, the more we are talking and writing about it, the more agency we are taking in our hands, it will definitely happen, but it will happen at its own pace. The fastest way to change education in our, at least in my study, I didn't saw as a very big factor because there are highly educated women that we found, and there is a whole paper by a very famous sociologist professor from Maryland. She has talked about we have a very good education rate, but why we don't, but we have a very bad employment rate. So employment has to be understood. Income and employment, definitely they are the places where if we intervene, we'll see the fastest change, right? But I mean, just imagine it's not a very, like, let's say, robotic science question. If you are a CEO, you have resources, you have income, you have the knowledge, and then think about the power relation. Versus if I am a school teacher in North India, let's say in Punjab, I get a fixed, salary, and my husband has a business. Just think about power relations. Power relations really play in the context we are, right? the situation, the culture, and everything. So income and employment, definitely they are the very important indicators where government should work or should prioritize to be inclusive of women, given in consideration that historically women have been marginalized on those indicators, right? So overnight we cannot really think South Asian women to become a CEO and operate, like, we don't have any. I don't think we have a good numbers here in the United States in terms of when we look at the private corporations, how many South Asian women we have who are in the C-suite jobs. No, very less, limited. I mean, they're a handful, I can count them. So that said, we need more policies that should boost, as Samina said, policies, affirmative action to boost women's employment. Now, with that employment, there's a two different story. What employment looks like for a woman in India and Pakistan versus what employment looks like for women in US, where we are saying we have a 56% employment rate. There's a difference between that as well. Here, if our South Asian women, if they are employed in low paid, low income jobs, right? That is, you are employed on paper, but that won't change your agency. AI will come in and your jobs will be gone. Think about, like those, though, from those angles. So when we're talking about South Asian women in the United States, we have to follow maybe a different capability framework in terms of how to enhance their capabilities so that they can lead and have, like, parity here is not about just numbers. But when we look back at the examples of, let's say, Pakistan or Sri Lanka or India, uh, on paper the employment has to be same first in terms of number. So we need some kind of policies there where we have to boost at least women's employment. It should be a norm that women are going to work, they're spending their time. So it's like two different strategies for two different contexts. Now, back in India, we have something that is like what I'm worried about. There are two things that is happening. One is they have definitely increased the quota for the women. So there is something called civil services, which is also in Pakistan, a very, reputed, like, government jobs. So they have increased the quota. Now there is another whole lot discussion going on there that, by with the increase in quota, women are getting selected. They are doing the job, but they are not capable of it, and people give evidences. See, this has been written by this woman, and look at this work done by a man. So there's a whole this thing. So the capabilities framework comes back in terms of, like, it's not like you have to increase their capability as well. So this is counterbacking. Now there's a whole thing called political structures of the country. So just to get the vote, now they are talking about in North India having paternity leave. And I am 100% sure men will just take advantage of it. They will sit at home, they will ask their wives to make. So it has to be like a lot of different pieces, as Samina said, it has to be mixed. A lot of different pieces has to go in terms of which one of this factor will play a very important role in shifting this change. But in what context? Are we talking about women in Pakistan? Then our approach strategy has to be different. Yes, employment policies has to be in place. We need affirmative actions. We need things there. But if we're talking about South Asian women in the United States, then I think the story is a little different. We need a different kind of strategy. It's not just about employment. It's more than that. Then the leadership and other things will come in, decision-making powers, and those things comes in. So definitely income and employment gives you, as I said, if you are a women CEO, then just think about your status versus, if you are employed, but you are just employed like a regular person. So that's the difference. But Samina, you want to contribute if I have missed anything?
No, that's great. I mean, there's so many questions. I feel like,
Yeah,
that's
there are
it.
so many questions and we
Yeah.
are short on time. Let's see. I think a lot of them were answered. I think at least two questions I see here which were answered by both of you. I'm going to read the next question on screen. It says, you compare South Asia with South Asian diaspora communities in the US. What similarities or differences stood out most strongly between these two contexts, and what do these differences tell us about the role of culture versus policy support systems?
Yeah, maybe I can start for this one. Um, I mean, I think this may vary depending on which diaspora community we're talking about, right? Because we are everywhere in the world. So if we're talking about, for the United States, the historically the types of South Asian immigrants who would come were preferred by the immigration system if they were higher education, higher income, right? So there was often uh, even sponsorship, right, that may take place from your employer to be able to come, or sponsorship to go to school. So I think that was the entryway for my parents. They both came in the 1960s, following the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act, which again really prioritized highly skilled immigrants, right? So with that, because you're getting, and this is, I think, consistent with diaspora communities for a number of countries, at least in the European or US context. Oftentimes, the people who have the money, the resources to be able to immigrate tend to be higher income, higher caste, right? So there is a replication, a sort of social reproduction of both their values, right, or their status or their privileges in what happens with communities that are based here. I found the communities to be quite distinct, to be honest. Like when I go, we were just talking about this, Somi and I, that many of the families that we know here in the US are so much more conservative than families in South Asia, and that there is really this sort of, for my parents at least, because they came in the 60s, they have this very sort of masum, like, understanding of like, the way that India was, and there's a lot of nostalgia, and there's a lot of fear of losing traditions. So I think, many folks of that generation really clung to those values. And then at the same time, for folks like me who were born in the US, it's changed over time. Like when I was quite young, for many, many years, I was the only South Asian person. Forget like Indian, or like if I want to say Hyderabadi, like it's not that specific, like anything South Asian, right? And then when I finally switched schools and it was a little bit diverse, my best friend was another Indian girl, and it was, in retrospect, like you really, as a minority person here, seek out those sorts of connections, whether knowingly or not. I was, 11, 12 when I met her. So it wasn't like we had made some like conscientious decision to, wanting to recreate our cultural values or something, right? It was just, she was the other brown girl. And by default, she was Hindu. Like there were many things about us that are not similar, but in the immigrant context, a lot of that melts because there's so few of us to begin with that you start to identify with people that you may not have as closely identified with back home, in your host, whatever, India, Pakistan, whatever, Bangladesh country. So I found that really interesting, or also that family becomes redefined. Like I have quite distant family members who happen to have, immigrated to the US, and they are like my closest family because they are the people who are here. Biologically, it's like, whatever. It's like Chacha's sister, whatever. There's this whole like, mix of not direct closeness. So I think kinship also gets redefined in those contexts, or also where people from the same part of India, this is quite common in diaspora communities, or whatever, I shouldn't say India only, Pakistan, anywhere, right, will form kind of a sub-community. And those communities are often they're very closely knit, but they're also very kind of exclusive, right? And again, like those sort of, like there's the very strong kind of upper caste, Gujarati, New Jersey family that I can conceive in my mind, right?
Gujaratis are not upper caste. They are traders, yeah. Anyway, they are trading community. We have this Varna system, right? So they come on the third one.
Okay, thanks. The whole state, right? All of them merchants. Yeah, anyway, whatever. Yeah, so I mean, that type of thing, where there's this sort of, definitely, caste discrimination is a big thing, shockingly kind of in the US, especially I think in industries like Silicon Valley, where you have, or tech, I should say, where you have, again, predominantly upper caste people that are coming, that are being sponsored by tech companies to be employed. And then, also a kind of mixing of the types of immigrants that are coming. And apart from even caste, even the North Indian, South Indian piece, or North India slash Pakistan, I feel like there's more there, especially language, right? I mean, I'm from Hyderabad, so Hyderabad, we speak Urdu. Well, it's dying, but historically, Urdu was spoken. And so for that reason, I feel much more connected to North, but culturally, I don't. I mean, many things about the North India that I'm like, oh, this is not the same, right? And I think that's regionally the case. So you see that kind of discrimination, I think, against darker skinned South Asians or who tend to be South Indians or Sri Lankans as compared to North Indians or Pakistanis. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, add
Yeah.
to that, when Samina was saying this unpaid care work is huge among the Gujarati, they call themselves as North Indians here, which I have interacted many times, but looks
You
like
don't consider it North India? You want to say
yeah.
what?
No, they introduced themselves as North India. I was like, what?
But
You
what do
guys
you
is
call
not
it?
West India.
West India, yeah.
Yeah, you guys are rich, you have port, you do trading, but it's very traditional. So I feel like somewhere, they are very traditional. So I
Mm.
mean, if anyone wants to do, let's say we have a PhD student, I would say just go run the descriptive statistics in terms of within the South Asian diaspora, look at the women of different race and ethnicity and their employment.
Yeah.
And they glorify it. I was telling you this yesterday. They glorify it. So there's a story. I mean, I'll share. When I was new to the country, I went to this place called Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan because it's a literary, like a small library, cultural. And when you are new to the country, as you know, when we're talking about South Asian diaspora, you want to know what is here. You just want to know the stuff there. So and this person is telling me, Gujarati person, he's no more. He was telling me, but तुमको रोटी बनाना पड़ेगा घर पे जाके तुम्हारा इतना सब टाइम अभी तुमको लगता है तुम काम कर पाओगी but I was like
Yeah.
what like
Right.
what like I was disappointed, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the thing. So when we talk about the South Asian side, South diaspora, I think it's just as Samina said, context.